Hi guys, I hope this finds you well. I am missing you guys and feeling like it's disappointing not to be together. So I thought this week that we would start with obviously dealing with what we're all dealing with, which is the coronavirus. This is obviously you can see what's in front of you, but this is the most recent case count as of today. Right now, according to the New York Times. And you can read this summary, like more than 2,500 people with the coronavirus have now died in the United States. And what I wanted you to see is just that historically, there was another flu about the same time frame that we have been studying that swept through the United States and in 1918. And so I'm going to read you a story today. And we're going to compare and contrast some of the ways that people dealt with the 1918 flu pandemic with the way that we're handling the coronavirus today. Are you ready? So the story I have for you is called Another Kind of War. And it's happening in world history. We were just dealing with the end of World War I. So this is happening at the same time, 1918. Just FYI, the very first coronavirus was reported on December 1st. And so this is about another kind of war. In 1918. I had a little bird, and his name was Enza. I opened the window, and in flew Enza. Influenza, say it fast and it becomes influenza. It was a catchy little rhyme, and the boys and girls were skipping rope to it in 1918. But it was also an epidemic too. It was worse than that. It was actually a pandemic. It means that a disease that spreads across many nations. And this one went around the globe, and it was deadly, just like the one we're dealing with today. Diseases don't fly in the window, but the influenza of 1918 almost seemed to. It lasted about 9 months. Worldwide, it killed 20 million people. That was more than the total of deaths during the 4 years of the Great War. Mysteriously, it struck about the same time in India and Russia and China, and no major nation escaped it. I do want you to think really quickly about when we were talking about trench warfare and how unbelievably deadly that World War I was. I want you to keep that in mind as we're talking about the numbers around this flu pandemic. 50 million people worldwide. That's incredible. In the United States, where more than 500,000 victims were, on one just terrible day in Philadelphia, almost 1,000 people died. Neither doctors nor hospitals nor cemeteries could handle the volume. I do want you to take a look at the poster I found from the 1918 flu pandemic and what sort of suggestions they were giving to people and how similar they are to what we're being asked to do today. Stay at home. Walk outside as opposed to taking public transportation, wear masks. Neither doctors nor hospitals nor cemeteries could handle the awful burdens put upon them in those days before the discovery of modern medicines. There were little doctors could do. In New York and Chicago, laws were passed making it illegal to sneeze or cough in public. Without a handkerchief, anyway. Police dutifully hauled sneezers and coughers to court, where they were given stiff fines. The police had time to worry about influenza because robbers and murderers were sick too. In October of 1918, Chicago's crime rate dropped almost by half. This picture I put here because in Washington, D.C., they found the only way they could make sure they had enough rooms in hospitals was to keep the undertakers stationed outside so they could take the dead away immediately, leaving room for more hospital beds. And it's kind of interesting because today, of course, we're dealing with a lack of hospital beds is a concern today. In addition, the thing that I just read about, like the crime rate dropping, I don't know if you guys are paying attention to the news, but there are jails that are, kind of opening the doors to some levels of kind of criminals so that the jails are emptier because they are prime breeding grounds for the disease to spread as well. The epidemic spread most rapidly in cities where people were crowded together, but many in the countryside died too. A prominent senator lost a son and a daughter. Soldiers fighting heroically against enemies they could see fell to invisible germs back in America. In America, the flu took 10 times as many lives as the war. I think on the last screen I had, hang on, right here. In the last week of October in 1918, 2,700 American soldiers died fighting in Europe, and that same week, 21,000 Americans died at home of the flu. Some of these headlines are interesting because you'll notice, we are talking about living in historic times, which we definitely are, but if you take a look at the headlines from the time period, they were doing the same sort of things. They were closing schools, closing churches, closing any sort of recreational, theaters and stores that weren't essential. Even postponing sports for all of you athletes that are really concerned. As I am too as a coach, we've worked hard and it is really frustrating to not be able to demonstrate those skills. But in 1918, the same sort of thing happened. It was called the Spanish influenza because people thought it had started in Spain, but it really hadn't. This specific flu pandemic started in the United States. It began in the United States from a disease of hogs. It was sometimes called the swine flu after the hogs, and some say it was the worst pandemic in history. It wasn't that it killed the most people, it was that it killed so rapidly. Someone figured mathematically that if it had continued spreading for another year at the rate it was going, the world's population could have been wiped out. By Armistice Day, November 11th, the peak had passed. The disease soon departed as mysteriously as it had arrived. It left the country exhausted. Wasn't a war terrible enough? Everyone had worked hard supporting the war effort. Americans had done astonishing things in factories and on farms. They'd fed Europe with an amazing harvest of grain. They'd armed the Allies. Citizens had given up luxuries and even some necessities to help others, and that flu epidemic seemed the final straw. Someone needed to find something to cheer people up. Little side note, I wanted to address something before we moved on. So first of all, in 1918, we referred to the influenza epidemic as the Spanish influenza, even though it had started in the United States. And I think oftentimes there's an interest in distancing yourself from being held responsible from what's going on, even though, of course, a virus, it's hardly, any specific country's fault. The same sort of things happening today. I don't know if you heard, but probably in the last week or so, there was some controversy over President Trump referring to the virus as like the Wuhan virus, and the G Summit wanted to clearly make sure that that sort of title wasn't used for this specific disease. So this quick article is about kind of the controversy around naming a disease. So the World Health Organization has given this specific disease a name that most people are referring to it by, COVID-19, and they did that on February 11th. You can see that in this article. But there are other people using terms like Wuhan virus and Asian virus. The problem with that is, of course, it has triggered like discrimination against people in the United States and around the globe. Even though it's anecdotal, my sister happens to be Korean. She works at Twin Star, and she's had people literally come through the door and say, "Oh, hopefully they're not treating you badly." And she's like, "Whoa, this is just crazy." to like have that kind of response, even in our own community, due to people viewing the disease as coming from a particular part of the world, even though she wasn't even born in China and she happens to be Korean. Okay, back to our historical story. So soon a new word was being used. It was normalcy, and that's what people wanted. They wanted to go back in time to a time before the war, to a time before this sort of life wasn't quarantining them. The boys and girls who were skipping rope in 1918 had no idea what was ahead for them. They wouldn't have believed it if you told them. Normalcy, no way. They were going to live in a world of radio and TV and computers and jets and rockets in 1918. That was stuff of science fiction. Their world was slow-paced and mostly powered by horses and mules. Their older brothers, the soldiers who came home from Europe in 1919, would have exciting things to tell them about. They'd been to Paris, they'd seen fancy nightclubs, stunning buildings, splendid boulevards. Some bragged about their heroism in battle, which was understandable. You had to be tough, or even lucky, to be a survivor of trench warfare. A few came home without arms and legs. Some didn't want to talk about the war at all. They too were looking for normalcy. But the returning soldiers were also surprised to find that America had changed in the years since they'd been gone, and they noticed two things right away. One had to do with beer and liquor. So take a look at this headline, wet or dry. So prohibition, probably should get rid of my screen now. Hang on. So in the bottom right corner of the news article on your screen, you can see that people are starting to talk about, like, what's to blame for the ills in the world. And some people have turned to blaming alcohol and started to talk about whether prohibiting alcohol might allow, the world to return to a healthier, better situation. They're not blaming alcohol use on the virus, so I'm not trying to say that, but people are looking for normalcy and looking to kind of create a scapegoat, and alcohol seems to be a good one. So anyway, they noticed two things right away. One had to do with beer and liquor. During the war, it was considered unpatriotic to drink alcohol. Beer was made from grain, and grain needed to be used to feed soldiers. And so now that the war was over, many people are putting an end to all liquor drinking. It would make the world a much better place, they said. The other change that was giving some soldiers a chuckle, women were demanding equal rights. They wanted to be full citizens, and soon they'd probably be wanting to wear pants too. Last piece with the last 2 minutes. This is called The Wild Beasts, this little segment. It was a cold winter day in 1913 when the doors opened at an old drafty armory on 25th Street at Lexington Avenue in New York City. And people got to see some new paintings and sculptures, including many from Europe. American art was never the same again. Some of the paintings in the Armory show were done by Henri Matisse, Paul Cézanne, Pablo Picasso, Vincent van Gogh. Today we know them all as great artists, but in 1913 their work was unlike anything most people had ever seen before. Matisse was part of a French group called Les Fauves, or the Wild Beasts. I might be mispronouncing that. I'm not a French language expert. Many viewers thought it was a good title for all the artists. One painting by Marcel Duchamp was called Nude Descending a Staircase. Classical paintings often showed naked figures reclining on couches. This painting showed what seemed to be a bunch of sticks, or maybe a figure. It was kind of hard to tell, but something very active was happening on the canvas. It was worth a second and even a third look. Many of the paintings included unrecognizable objects. Before, art had always been more or less imitating reality, but these paintings were completely different. In Chicago, some art students burned effigies, stuffed figures, of Henri Matisse, but many Americans were profoundly changed by this new modernism. The artist Stuart Davis said the Armory show was the greatest single experience in all of my work, and he was not alone. Okay. So we're going to be doing a little bit of work, like comparing. On the left, you've got the symptoms of the 1918 Spanish influenza, and on the right, the coronavirus symptoms. And